I'm Elaine Viets. Many of Florida's high school students have no health education classes. The Florida lawmakers said it wasn't a requirement 6 years ago. Even when public schools did have health education, it often wasn't very good. Health classes had old textbooks and cheesy videos. Fortunately, the Miami schools are hip. That's the Health Information Project. More than 600 people teach health education in Miami Dade County. Today, we're talking with the project's director, Risa Berrin. I'm Elaine Viets, and I'm talking to Risa Berrin, director of HIP, the Health Information Project in Miami, on today's Dead End Jobs show. Risa, what exactly is HIP?
HIP is a peer-to-peer comprehensive health education program that puts student teachers into the classrooms in Miami-Dade County high schools to provide everything from mental health to reproductive health, relationships, drugs and nutrition education to their peers. So we have 11th and 12th graders that are teaching the curriculum for 9th graders across the county.
And why do schools need this? What is modern health education?
So when I grew up, we had the typical, physical education teacher that was teaching us in the classroom. And as you mentioned, it was, outdated textbooks and videos that were decades old, and it really wasn't practical information that students could really make good decisions, whether or not they were in a crisis or just how to prevent themselves from getting into a health situation. And I found that there was, an opportunity in 2008 when they got rid of that old model that I had grown up with, an opportunity to do something more innovative. And we know based on the literature that when students are confronted by their peers, they're more likely to take those messages and really, act on them. And we found that, researching and polling the students, they really prefer being taught by someone that's a little bit older, but still someone that's within their high school. So we realized that removing these adults was actually the best way to provide effective health education.
Well, the kind of health education I had in school had so many euphemisms for sex, I'm surprised I didn't think that the stork brought the babies.
Right. It was always based on scare tactics, or, we know we can scare kids for a few hours or a few days, but that doesn't have any long-lasting effect. And it was constantly, don't do this, don't do that, but we weren't giving them the real reasons. We weren't telling them these are the consequences, or when confronted with this situation, or if your sister is suffering with this, or you see your mother is battling that, we weren't giving them the tools in order to make better decisions. But additionally, we weren't giving them practical information, but we also didn't know where to send them. So let's say you do feel that you're depressed, or your, sister is suffering from anorexia, or you notice that your friend is, mixing prescription pills not prescribed for them. What do you do? And so we weren't even providing kids with the access to the health resources. And oftentimes there's wonderful resources right here in our community, but kids didn't know how to get to them. They didn't know about insurance. They didn't know whether or not they needed to go with a parent to these health resources. And surfing the internet, we know there's a lot of bad information out there. And so we've created a program where, based on each school, they have a portal where it maps out all the health resources in a certain distance around that high school. So we've really made access to health care much easier for these kids. And we've told them where to go online to make sure that they're getting the reputable information.
Now, what kind of training do your student peer counselors have?
So the peer health educators are 11th and 12th graders, and in the first year they are chosen by the faculty and the administration in that initial year. And then after that, it's really word of mouth, and it's become so popular that they're rejecting dozens and dozens of kids at our schools that are 3, 4, 5 years into it. It's become, at most of our schools, the most popular club at the high schools, and I think the kids really look at it as a wonderful leadership opportunity, but they're learning as well. And so the process they go through is, they have to be nominated by a faculty person, they have to have an interview, they have to go through a rigorous application, and then there's benchmarks. They have to make sure that they are taking quizzes, and there are certain standards that we have in place to make sure that they are ready to go into the classroom. And our partnerships with both FIU and we are measuring everything in this program, to make sure that it is, an evidence-based program based on science, but that we also have measurable results. and that, includes proper training of these peer health educators.
What is FIU and MU?
FIU is Florida International University. We have a wonderful relationship with their College of Medicine, and we work very closely with the University of Miami's Department of Public Health Sciences.
Now, what about the nerd factor? Students who are chosen by teachers to be peer counselors, do they have...
So we are very, very strict, and when we partner with these high schools, we were very adamant that we didn't want this program to be led by the AP National Honor Society, high-achieving students. We knew that in order to get buy-in, knowing that we were going to use this positive power of peer influence to our benefit, we wanted to make sure that we had the football players and the baseball players and the cheerleaders, the kids in drama, the kids in art, and the schools have been wonderful about making sure that we have diversity. Kids that are involved in, different clubs and different sports and, diverse, when it comes to socioeconomic background. We want to make sure that every ninth grader that is, involved in this program, when 11th or 12th grader comes in there to teach their classes, that they can relate to them. And that's why we think this program has been so successful.
Now, is it taught during the school day or after school?
It is called, the peer health educators are trained both during the school day and predominantly after school. But the ninth graders, it's embedded into a core subject. So the Miami-Dade County schools, the principals have to decide whether it's going to go through world history or it's going to go through English or math. And the commitment that these principals make is that all ninth graders will get this program. We are of the belief that every kid is at risk for something, some sort of health issue, but they also should be given the chance to be healthy. And so that's why we don't come in and just take 30 or 40 kids that we think are at risk or 30 or 40 kids that we think are high achievers. We take all ninth graders. And so that could be 800 or 900 kids in a Miami-Dade County public school.
Now, what kinds of problems are you seeing in the Miami-Dade students?
So one thing that we did in the first few years is we asked the kids to post anonymous questions to our program, and we collected thousands of questions from ninth graders across the county, asking them, tell us what you want to know about health. What are you curious about? What's going on? And we also did a lot of, pre-testing and post-testing that we created in order to find out what are the core issues. We can see the national statistics. We can tell you what's going on the state level, and we can tell you what's going on. Sometimes we have the data, what's going on in Miami-Dade County, but we can tell you based on the information that we've gathered what the trends are. We can tell you that there's high incidences of sexual abuse that the kids report. There are high incidences of attempted suicide. A lot of children are dealing with depression, and they don't have an outlet for that. And we can pretty much tell you that, a particular teacher's class and a particular day, we can tell you how many kids there reported that they had been physically abused, how many have been bullied. Our data is so specific to a particular school because we've done such a good job of trying to find out what are the issues. We can see the national statistics, but it really hits home, and we can tell you what these prevalent issues are at each particular school.
I used to work at a newspaper, and we had a teen column called Peer Panel, where teenagers answered questions from other teens. It was anonymous. And some of these questions were just too hard for teenagers to handle. So how does your program, how do they handle the questions that are too thorny for someone who's 17 years old?
Right. So what happens is the peer health educators are trained to provide information, and they're trained to lead discussion. And they are the ones who direct the students to the adults either in their school or in the community, whether it's a doctor or it's a psychiatrist. We've lost a lot of our mental health counselors, our trust counselors in our schools. Guidance counselors are overwhelmed. The old health clinics no longer have any clinicians working in them. So it is very difficult, but these peer health educators are the ones who are providing them with information, and if the kids have questions, they're kind of triaging them and sending them to the resources at their schools. And we have found that the administration and the faculty, really tell us that they don't know what they did before HIP came, because they find that these peer health educators are their eyes and ears. They're better able to deal with all of the psychosocial and physical health needs of their students because the peer health educators are out there as health ambassadors counselors directing them to health resources. Before, these kids were totally under the radar and had nowhere to go, and now they're pulling teachers aside in the middle of sessions. They're coming up to them and saying, I need help. This is what's going on with me. And the administration and faculty are so grateful that, now kids feel a safe place to come forward to address some of these health issues and to prevent them from escalating.
Now, I was surprised by the outdated ideas that persisted among supposedly smart teenagers. Some of them thought you couldn't get pregnant the first time you had sex, and the old one about Coca-Cola being a good douche. Is that stuff still alive and well?
From the questions, as I mentioned, that we accumulated, they kind of fell into two categories that stunned us. One is what you just referred to, the, oh my gosh, they don't even know the basics. It's very sad that we have really done such a disservice to these kids that up until the 9th grade, they didn't know the basics about their health. And we're not just talking sexual health, just basic, whether it comes to hygiene or mental health, they don't know anything. And then the other kind of category we found when we were looking at these questions, it was a window into their personal lives. It was a cry for help. It was, my mother gets beaten by her boyfriend every night. I don't know what to do. My uncle comes into my room every night and he touches me. Who do I talk to? And so we kind of found that it fell into those two categories. And, both were heartbreaking to know that they didn't have the basic information, and they also just didn't know where to go when they knew that something was wrong.
How do you get around the problem of prudish parents who think that their kids are so innocent that they don't want them to know or get educated about sex and drugs?
Right. Well, I think you're always going to have parents that are either going to think, hey, my spouse and I, my partner and I, as parents, we can provide our kids with this information. And, we know that our program is up on the latest science. We have, a whole network of, physicians and academics and educators and people, all over the public health world that are guiding us on the right information, especially when, science is evolving. So you're always going to have parents that are going to think, hey, we know everything, or our values, are going to trump science. So I don't think we can ever kind of convince, those parents. But knowing that we've had 15,000 kids in the program this year, and so few of them, are not in the program because a parent had some sort of an issue, that's comforting to see, because as we know, South Florida is very diverse and people come from very diverse backgrounds. And I think the beauty of the HIP program is that when we're giving these kids science, we also incorporate into the curriculum conversations about culture. Because if your grandmother at home says, you know what, in our home country, we don't believe in being sad, you're going to snap out of it, there's no such thing as depression, and I'm going to cook you something great in the kitchen and you're going to feel better, we can't say to that kid, oh, well, grandma's wrong. We have to help them reconcile science and culture. And I think because we've had that level of respect, we've been so well received in populations, all across Miami-Dade County, which, as you know, are very diverse.
Now, drugs. Are kids still playing pill roulette, mixing whatever pills they find in their parents' bathroom medicine cabinet?
Yes. We are definitely seeing a lot of prescription pill abuse. We still obviously, the latest thing is, the kids are challenging, obviously a lot of the adults in the world about marijuana, as they see that it's becoming legal in some states. Hey, the old tactics of say no to drugs of my generation, just don't work with this group. They're very intelligent. They know a lot more, as far as what's out there, what's being challenged politically. But as far as, the prescription pill abuse, that is, very difficult. It's a problem, and the kids don't really understand that, mixing just one beer with their Vicodin that may have been prescribed for them is even a danger, or mixing that Vicodin with the Adderall that may have been prescribed for their ADHD. So sometimes it's these subtle things that no one's really taken the time to explain things to them, and that's the sad part, is that oftentimes, if they had the information, they would really make much better decisions. If they saw a friend passed out at a party, they would, not hesitate to call 911 because we've explained to them the legal ramifications. And we would also explain to them that person is not napping, that could be their body is shutting down because they're ODing. And no one's really given them a shot to say, this is really what's going on here. So with this information, now we want you to make better decisions.
What kind of drugs are common now in Florida schools?
We still see a lot of marijuana. That's still definitely very popular. There's definitely a lot of prescription pill abuse with the attention deficit drugs. Kids are definitely, abusing them. I think that, there's always, certain drugs that, become much more popular. Now we see with a lot of, these party weekends, Miami has become quite the destination. We find that a lot of our high schoolers are attending these parties, and ecstasy is, very common. And, we know that they are definitely being confronted, by a lot of new drugs and a lot of these synthetic drugs. We know that marijuana, compared to the 70s is much more potent. So what they're seeing is, they don't even understand until they get our program, is going to have more of an effect on them. So I think, there's always going to be the beer and there's always going to be the pot, but then we kind of come in with these trends that kind of come in and out, and oftentimes they're the same drugs just with different names.
Now, what about educating attitudes? I have a friend who teaches at a South Florida high school, and a girl was raped by another student. And the teacher was shocked because the girls in the class told her that the victim brought it on herself because, quote, she acts like a hoe. Do you educate students about rape?
Absolutely. We actually have scenarios embedded into our relationships curriculum that deal with that scenario that you just talked about, that it doesn't matter what you're wearing or how you're acting, we talk about, acquaintance rape and date rape, and we also give them the tools for if you are raped, what do you do after a sexual assault? The kids don't know, don't shower. Besides calling 911 and getting, a rape kit, examination, they don't know what to do in those first few hours. They don't know that, 48 to 72 hours are really, really important. And they oftentimes, don't even know how to deal with the psychological impact of it, especially if a sexual assault occurred amongst, from a family member. And so I think that definitely a big portion of our program is talking about these things, so we make sure that kids understand that this is, acceptable to talk about this, that we need to advocate for ourselves, but we also need to protect and advocate for each other. So in a situation like that, kids who go through the HIP program are definitely understanding, what is appropriate and what isn't, and by, not talking about these things for decades, we really did a disservice to our kids because they didn't know that there were, places to go and that certain behavior was definitely not acceptable.
Now, oral sex. Some kids don't consider that real sex because you can't get pregnant.
Right.
How does your program deal with that?
Our program talks about sex, that oral sex is sex, and that, we have information obviously based on the Centers for Disease Control, telling you what are the diseases that you can get, the different viruses and diseases. So we definitely do not diminish the dangers of oral sex. You might not be able to get pregnant that way, but we definitely, deal with that, in a very, scientific, matter-of-fact way, so kids understand that that is a real issue and that is something that you need to protect your body parts. And, we talk about everything from herpes to human papillomavirus and, vaccinations for HPV like Gardasil. And I have to tell you, watching, obviously I've watched many of these sessions over the years as, an observer and having created the program. And I have to tell you, there's a lot of deer in headlights looks and a lot of dropped jaws because no one ever told them. They thought that was the safer version. It's the, I guess in my generation, we grew up with the just say no to everything, of the Nancy Reagan era, and everyone was very concerned about pregnancy. And while that is a huge, huge concern, we have, some of the highest rates of sexually transmitted infections and diseases in the whole country right here in South Florida, and, the highest incidences of HIV and AIDS. And so that's really something that, we really need to impress upon our kids. It's not just HIV, AIDS. We have epidemics of chlamydia and epidemics of gonorrhea. And if they do get themselves, into these situations, there's also ways of dealing with it. They can go to the doctor. They can get tested. They can, be treated with some of these bacterial infections with antibiotics. But as I said, they just generally just don't have the tools or the resources or the information.
Well, the greatest fear I used to run into when we had this peer counseling is, how do I handle Mom? What if Dad finds out?
I think that's a prevalent issue with pretty much everything in our curriculum, because our curriculum deals with everything from mental health and drugs and relationships and reproductive health. So I think there's always a barrier of, oh, well, you know what, I don't want to talk to my parents about this. I don't even want to talk to them about, the eating disorder. I don't want to talk to them about the anxiety that I'm suffering from. And I think, the beauty of our program is we're giving them numerous outlets, that if they don't feel safe talking to their parent, that there's other trusted adults that can give them guidance and can give them treatment. Because the reality is there's always going to be, a large majority of our population of adolescents that just don't want to talk to mom and or dad, just because there's that great divide. And that's the beauty of our program, is that the same information could be delivered from mom and dad or a teacher or a doctor or a professor, but the kids aren't going to listen to it. It's not going to resonate because they're going to blow it off and say, hey, you don't know what I'm going through. It was different when you were my age. And they can't say that when it's another student that's leading the discussion. They feel that there's a different relationship and there's a different, more common understanding. So it's just the mechanism that we're delivering the information that's different.
Are city kids, Miami kids, more likely to experiment with sex and drugs than students in, say, a country school?
You mean, I guess, inner city versus suburbia?
Right.
We have seen that the same issues are present in some of our most impoverished inner city schools and the same issues at some of our more affluent suburban schools. And, that's the beauty of this program, is that we find that it really resonates with every kind of population and that we are seeing the same things going on. It could be that maybe one school has more young girls who are pregnant, but pretty much they're all dealing with the same kinds of issues. And I think that's one thing that we've tried to impress upon the community, is that this isn't just an inner city thing. This isn't something that our D and F rated FCAT schools are suffering from. This is in our higher achieving so-called A schools. And really, when we bring them together on HIP Day at the end of the year, and this year we'll have all 600 of the peer health educators, the beauty of it is that they get to talk to each other and realize that they are dealing with the same things and they are having the same impact on their campuses, and it doesn't really matter the location of their schools.
Do you think it's harder to be a teenager today, or are we now looking at issues that used to be covered up when we were teenagers?
I think that obviously, being bombarded by the media and especially social media, I think we're probably making it more complicated, and I think there's access to more misinformation now where you didn't have, the internet and all these other, easy ways of accessing information, which is, as I said, oftentimes wrong. But I think it's really the same issues. I think we just did a really good job of shoving it under the rug. And I think now kind of the beauty of the HIP program is saying, hey, as a community, this is unacceptable. And what we're doing in the state of Florida is very similar to what's going on around the country. We're no different. It was the same poor health education classes with, no benchmarks and no standards to show that it was effective. And I think that now it's time to say, hey, we need to not cover our eyes anymore. We need to really deal with these issues head on, and that there's really easy solutions oftentimes. It doesn't take a lot of money. I jokingly say we use child labor in our program, and we're proud of it. We use the best commodity we had available in our schools, and I think that's also kind of the difference and the different feeling and why it's been so wonderfully accepted across the county, is because it isn't outsiders coming in to help us, rescue us, or save us or provide education. This is something that we're doing within the schools. They're helping themselves, and I think that's really the beauty of it. So
we have about a minute left. Can you
Sure.
tell me what surprised you the most about this program?
I think the most surprising thing was that we didn't give our students enough credit. That I think that we always thought that we needed to interfere and that we needed to be the ones educating them as adults. But I think we have so much to learn from them. And I think it's been very, very humbling to see how effective they have been as role models, as health ambassadors, as student educators. And I think it was we just didn't take advantage of them. And I think they were always sitting there waiting to rise to the occasion. And now that we've called upon them, they really are transforming, our campuses in Miami-Dade County to be healthier places. And I think that was the most surprising thing.
Well, thank you, Risa Berrin, Director of HIP, the Health Information Program in Miami-Dade County. I'm Elaine Viets, and you're listening to the Dead End Job Show.